And here's a cutaway of the subway system in Manhattan. During the Hudson-Fulton Celebration, New Yorkers looked backward to create a contrast with modern times. This was important because they felt as if the whole world were watching the progress of their city. As one editorial put it, it was not a celebration of Hudson or Fulton, but a tribute to New York City that gauged the skills of its civic leaders, the behavior of its citizens, and the performance of urban systems. And next, please. Here's the history of New York Parade at Columbus Circle. Today, we recognize the Hudson-Fulton Celebration as a snapshot of a city, a state, a nation, and a society. And as much as we might be alternately amused, inspired, perplexed, and offended by the progressive mindset of 1909, there is something satisfying in knowing that these civic leaders were convinced that the 20th century would be New York's century. It would become not only the metropolis of the Western Hemisphere, but arguably the greatest city in the world. Next. In documenting their 1909 history holidays so thoroughly, New Yorkers gave us a lens with which to look back at them and their world, a valuable tool as we consider the viability of the metropolis of New York and the whole Hudson Valley in the year 2009. Thank you. Do you have any questions or comments? Yes?
What happened to the Claremont, the original one from 1909, the replica?
It eventually ended up in the Rondout Creek. It had been purchased by one of the Dayline companies there and was part of sort of a pleasure grounds. Eventually, the Henry Ford Museum would come in and take part of its machinery. And is it true that you can still see its ribs at low tide? Up until a few years ago, I've heard that's true. And the Half Moon was sent up to, eventually ended up in Cohoes, and where it burned about 1930 or so. Yes?
Okay. We saw photographs of many floats, and even though steam, electric, and gasoline-powered vehicles were not yet commonplace, but were certainly around, and the organizers wanted to celebrate progress, they all seem to be horse-drawn. Has that occurred to you? I mean, it probably was a little less expensive to do it that way, but...
Yes, Wind has observed that the irony of the floats in the parades being pulled by horses rather than by trucks or steam or cars, and that definitely was possible. I actually had never thought about that. And they also were, it was sort of an added irony because they'd just done away with horse-drawn trolleys at that year or the year before. So it's a good point. It may be that they thought this was easier to, I guess if I had to surmise why, it may be what they were thinking about sending them upriver to the other towns where horses would be much more common. And we know that they use local horses. In Catskill, for instance, the streets were too small to unload the floats. The floats couldn't move through the streets, so people went on the barges and looked at the floats. Yes, sir?
I'm interested in the Vermeer that you showed. Where I never saw that painting. Where is it? Do you happen to know where it is?
Yes, the question is about the Vermeer painting that was shown, and it today is part of the Metropolitan Museum's collection. Benjamin Altman willed, I think, 4, perhaps a few more paintings to the Met when he died, and that was about 1913. So many of the paintings now that were part of that show are happily part of Americans. Public has access to them, And even at that time, reviewers said that this would be part of the ethos of American collecting among millionaires, that they would know that they wouldn't necessarily keep these locked up, that they would be shared by the public, by artists and art lovers. So that was part of that tone of the event. Any other questions or comments? Yes, Patterson.
You said you knew a little bit more about the Kingston and the Poughkeepsie celebrations. What were their distinguishing features?
The question is about the Kingston and Poughkeepsie features. Well, in some ways they were very similar to the formula of the Rivertown events, but there were some sort of telling events that kind of offer us a window into 1909. For example, a great headline in the paper was the fact that the Governor Charles Evans Hughes rode on a torpedo boat. It took him from Poughkeepsie up to Kingston for the festivities, and it reached the unheard of record, or miles. It went 26 miles per hour, which set a on-water record for ship travel on the Hudson River. That was faster than anybody could dream of. In Kingston, they dedicated a plaque to Sir Thomas Chambers, a founding father, at the Industrial Home, which was an orphanage. And in Hudson, the first dedication of a public monument occurred. It was a water fountain that serviced both people and small animals. And at this time, public water fountains were sort of implicitly connected to the temperance movement in the United States. So these little snapshots, tell us a little bit about what of our collective ancestors were concerned with. Yes, you.
How would you compare the 1909 celebration with this year's celebration?
Hugh asked, how would I compare the 1909 celebration with this year's celebration? Well, they're very different. I mean, I think we have to say that this year's celebration was nowhere near as extensive as the 1909 celebration. And in part that's, we could talk all day about economic conditions, but I think it's very revealing about the differences in our society. How this kind of community life and coming together for parades and the importance of all these fraternal organizations, the volunteerism, that was very much something of 1909. I think we have different ideas about community today, and we have different communities. We have online communities. We have a society that's sort of maybe more niche-oriented. So I guess I would just, maybe even open it up to the floor or ask you to think about how it's different. And that's really what this book was meant to do, was to sort of describe 1909 and then allow people to think about their own lives today and the way they think about history and their community. Well, thank you very much for coming.